Good morning again then everybody, and welcome to this webinar from Azure. We today are going to be focusing on personal and organisational resilience, but we'll be taking a slightly different view, and whilst not asking everybody to stand on their heads and perform this amazing yoga pose, at the same time we do think it will be something that from a current world point of view, that we will need to develop a very different approach perhaps to our resilience. So today we're going to explore that and hopefully give you a little bit of food for thought. So I'm Lorraine, and I am part of the Azure organisation. We're a very small leadership and organisational development consultancy, but we work with some wonderful clients and have the opportunity to support their leadership and organisational development in a variety of different ways. We do, of course, find ourselves in very unusual times at this point in our lives, and it may be that we are searching back into our files of old experience, or the things that we've known before, or ways that we've been able to support ourselves in change before, and for sure some of those will be helpful to us. But I think also what we're seeing at this point in time is that there is a need for a new approach in many areas of our lives, work and personal, and that's true both on an individual level but also on a collective level when we start to think about organisations. And so this quote by Deepak Chopra speaks to me a little bit about that tendency that we have as human beings to rely quite heavily on our past experience, and that can sometimes hold us back in terms of mindset and approach to what might be needed at this time in this moment. So we are recording today, and we will send this out afterwards to those people who've been on the call. If there's time at the end, and there may not be, I'm certainly happy to open it up, but I'm going to kind of walk through a number of thoughts and ideas that hopefully will support and provoke your own thoughts about resilience. So, as I've said, I'd invite you to bring a slightly different mindset to this, and maybe not think about resilience completely in the way that you have done, or maybe even some other seminars and workshops and webinars that you may have attended. So I'm going to try and come at this from a slightly different point of view. And the four areas that I'm going to be talking us through and walking us through today are what we can learn from the natural world, because I think there's a huge amount there that can show us how to not only survive this period that we're in and all that will come in the future, but actually to thrive in that space and to develop a very natural level of not only just resilience, but capability and beingness. And also to come back into the field of human psychology, because of course that underpins a lot of the thinking around resilience, and look at a couple of key aspects of that from a slightly different perspective perhaps. Learning any of the research that you look at around resilience, anything that you will have done in this area, will also speak about how we learn, if we learn, and what approach we bring to that learning. So again, I want to step into that a little bit. And yes, we will hopefully all be dancing by the end of this, if not literally, then in some way within ourselves we will have found our inner dancer, and we'll just sum up and say a little bit more about that at the end. So this is the journey we're headed on over the next 45 minutes or so, and I hope that it will be stimulating for you. It seems important, though, to start with where are we now, and just to take stock a little bit of the context within which organisations and individuals are currently working. And I'm not going to spend hours talking about this current situation. I think we're probably well versed in a lot of the themes that are around at the moment, except to say one word, and that's emergence. I think what we are facing at the moment is a need to get into closer relationship with the principles and practices of a more emergent time and a more emergent life. In other words, to challenge ourselves on the predictability, the reliability, the things that we've always been able to place as a point of certainty in our lives, and to hold those more lightly and hold some of our mindsets and attitudes about those things a little more lightly. So emergence is a word you'll hear a reasonable amount during today's session. But I want to tap in a little bit to some of the material that many of you may well have already connected with and looked at in one form or another. And I've just picked out this model of organisational resilience from Roffey, and there are many different models out there that can help us to think about resilience. And I picked this one because I think it starts to lean a little bit more into the core underpinnings of organisational resilience in a world such as that we are facing today. And as we see from, I'm not expecting you to read all the detail here, and the Roffey report is available. You can catch it online very easily, it's dated 2018. But they pick out 4 key areas, and these are worth holding in our minds also as we go through this session. The first is around purpose and values, and here I would tend to bring in the importance of meaning behind all of this. How do we make meaning out of our world? How do we make meaning out of our organisational life? And how do we help people to do that? Because that actually builds a whole different level of resilience. So meaning will be something we'll come back to. Relationships are highlighted in this model. And again, as we're probably noticing, the social contact, the sense of how good or otherwise our relationships are, is very important to us and enables us not only to get things done, but also to have a deeper sense of well-being and a sense of equilibrium. So the quality of our relationships and fostering these is key. Learning features very heavily in the Roffey model, and particularly the degree to which we're open to learning. And some of us will think about that in a very perhaps particular way of acquiring new knowledge. But actually, to be someone who's open to learning means being much more in the moment and much more immediate about that, and really seeing each moment as an opportunity to learn. And then shared leadership, which is very much about empowerment and delegation. And again, we are seeing quite a bit of that coming onto the stage now as we talk with clients who are working their way through some of the challenges of the current time, and that actually we can't rely so heavily on control or some of the management practices that may have been in place previously. So I'd like to now bring us into a way of looking at resilience from some research that was done with Cranfield and commissioned by the British Standards Institute. And here, this 4-box model, which is, these are always helpful and useful just to get a few ideas on the table, invites us to think about the way in which organisations approach resilience, but also we can think about this from an individual point of view along a couple of continuums. The degree to which we focus heavily on the need for consistency, so expressed here as goals, processes and routines, and the degree to which we are open to be more flexible in terms of our ideas, our views, and the way we take action. And then on the vertical axis, the degree to which we have a more progressive mindset when it comes to achieving results, and the degree to which we take a more security-minded, defensive, protective approach to our resilience and to the way we approach organisations. And what happens when we look at a model like this is that, as you might imagine, we ideally would hope to see broadly some activity going in all areas. In other words, that any organisation that is fostering resilience is able to look at the things that need to be put in place that will deliver consistency and a more steady and improvement-oriented culture towards the way we do things around here. But it will also have a really healthy expression of the more flexible approach. So in the more defensive protective quadrant here, we're looking at being more alert, noticing, responding, being more in the moment, and using that to help us to adapt. And in the more progressive area, we're really getting into more imaginal and creative spaces, so really opening things up. Sadly, what tends to happen, particularly in times of pressure and crisis and stress, is that there is a massive rush towards the bottom left-hand corner. What can we control more? Where can we put more processes in place? Where can we put in place things that will help us to feel more secure? And of course, the time that we're living in now means that this is really not something that is helpful to us. It's not going to get us in a good way, in a healthy way, in a way that gives us a basis of balance and equilibrium. It's not going to get us where we need to be. One more model just to kind of really set the context for some of what's going to come in terms of the 4 areas I mentioned. And that's this Canafin model, which is comes from work by Daniel Snowden and is used quite extensively. It's not new, it goes back to 1999, but has been used in a number of different ways as we've organisationally and individually learned to understand a little bit more about the way in which the organisational space and indeed the world around us is changing. And what we tend to see is that we can divide our world up into 4 broad areas. Those things that are simple and can be operationalised very quickly, those things that are a bit more complicated but where we can apply some good analysis and some good expertise, and we can turn that into best practice or good practice. And then on the left-hand side of this model, again, not dissimilar to the BSI work, we see that there's a more flexible approach that needs to be taken in the complex space where we see that things are coming at us thick and fast and we're not able to use perhaps some of the tried and tested methods. And here we need to develop a more emergent practice where we are much more responsive and much more open in the moment to what is in front of us. At times we may find that we get into a place where that is a place of overwhelm, and some have experienced that in these last couple of months. And here we really have to be on our mettle, just very much acting and then sensing into what has gone on and then adjusting our response as we need to. That's in the more chaotic space. What we hope to avoid is disorder. But again, that can come in. What often happens, though, again, as we see in times of pressure, is that there is a tendency to want to simplify things, to make them easy, to make them approachable and digestible by people. And that emphasis on operationalizing, on standardizing, on controlling our world will not serve us well in resilience terms at this point, and I believe going forward. So let's come back then to our agenda, which is, as I said, fourfold: the natural world, human psychology, learning and dancing. And we're going to start with the natural world, and it's around us. And in fact, many people have spoken in recent weeks about their deeper connection with the natural world, paying more attention to it and noticing it more. And there's a couple of things that I think are helpful to us if we look at this area a little more closely. And that's the principles of cycles, rhythms, and flow. And we can look at those in terms of principles like birth, death, and rebirth, the seasons, and the degree to which nature is flexible and adaptable. So let's start, first of all, then with seasons within the space of cycles and rhythms. We're all very familiar, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, with very distinct seasons. We broadly get a spring, albeit that things are not quite so delineated these days, but we broadly get a spring, we get a summer, we get an autumn, and we get a winter. And nature does different things in each of these seasons. In the spring, we tend to see new growth, and as gardeners, perhaps we're out there planting new seeds. In the summer, we tend to nurture, and we see those plants strengthen and bloom and blossom and come to fruition and really bring colour and vibrancy into the world. In the autumn, we tend to be more looking at harvesting and storing. How do we get the value and use that value? And if we go back, obviously, centuries, really keep that value over many, many months. Of course, we now have all sorts of mod cons where we don't have to pay quite so much attention to that. And then in the winter, much more of a hibernation mode, and we certainly see plants go underground, disappear, and regenerate using the earth to draw nutrients in order to be able to come back again in the spring. So what's this got to do with resilience, and both organisationally and individually? Well, in our experience, there is a heavy tendency, because of task focus, because of action focus, because of the huge to-do list and the aspiration to achieve a lot, there's a heavy emphasis on spring and summer. We tend to start lots of new projects. We tend to want to grow them and make sure that they are implemented and, you know, have some success and deliver something. There's a lot less emphasis on the autumn and winter stages. We tend not to pay so much attention to actually getting the full harvest, going into the learning process that we can gather from any new projects or any processes or any practices that are in place. So our learning, the autumn phase, the harvesting, the drawing out the value of our work in the spring and summer stages tends not to have quite the same emphasis in most organizations. And we certainly don't recognize the winter period, the regeneration, the regrouping, the opportunity to step back, reflect, be silent for a bit, see what actually wants to emerge. And working with these seasons is something that we can apply at so many different levels within our lives, personally and organizationally, and think about how and when we initiate new things, what do we do with them? When is the right time to do it? Do we have a full life cycle going around anything that we get underway? On a more practical level, also just with seasons for a second, even just being aware of our own body rhythms and biorhythms, they change literally change in these seasons. And we find we have different energies, and respecting that in the way that we set our lives up, particularly as we think now about some of the flexibility that maybe is available to us in the way that we work. This is important as part of ongoing resilience. Coming to the birth, death, and rebirth ideas, what we see in nature is a very, unemotional, just get on with it. Something grows, something dies, it comes back round again. It may live, it may be used to bring nutrition to the earth, and something else may live. But there is that acceptance of a cycle. Things come in, they go, and then they come back again in some form. So for us in resilience terms, that's about things like creativity, recognizing the process of creation, and that often in creativity we have to be prepared to let go in order to allow things to come in. If we're feeling blocked or stuck in any way, shape or form, it's really helpful if we are able to allow some stuff out of our lives or out of our mind or even out of our beliefs. And doing the sort of spring cleaning, the housekeeping that allows us to let some stuff actually disappear will create space that allows new things to come in. So again, in terms of resilience, again, when we look at the organizational space, so often we allow things to layer and layer and layer and accumulate. We're not so good at the stopping and letting go part of things, cutting stuff out, cutting away, so that we can have new growth at the right time and in the right way. And this requires us to step into more trust. Nature itself is very trusting. It just is. It's in its nature to just keep coming back if it's meant to be. For us, we tend to hold on. And we tend not to trust in the same way, typically as human beings. And so being willing to step into a little bit more trust and allow things to go if they're meant to, and then come back if they're meant to, will foster a greater level of creativity. And we sometimes can feel that unless we are following something and keeping it in place consistently, then we are not being good people, good leaders, good team members. But challenging things that perhaps it's time to let go of is also good for our resilience. The third thing that I wanted to pick out from the natural world was this idea of flow. Flow is something that we all know when we feel it. It's something that we experience, when we're in that moment and everything just seems to line up. And we have that really strong feel-good factor, and we're just moving easily, gracefully, in that moment. It can be literally moments, and it can last, if we're lucky, for hours and possibly even days and maybe even months. And we have that sense of rhythm. We're in that space where things are moving easily. If we look to nature as our teacher in this area, again, organisationally and individually, we can see that what nature does is, in order to maintain flow consistently, is that it adapts. If an obstacle comes its way, it works around it, and it's patient, and it takes its time, and it finds another route, or it works with the environment. Water on rocks creates eventually a new pathway over time. So that adaptability, that flexibility, starts first with the willingness to accept that there will be things that come up. Things will not always look straightforward, smooth, and flow in a linear fashion. And therefore, if we know that there will be what we might call obstacles or things that we have to work around, we can adopt a mindset that says, how can I keep myself in flow? Well, firstly, I have to accept, and then I can start to use my creativity to think about how I can adapt and bring my flexibility in. What we hold throughout this process is our focus on purpose or our goal or what it is we're trying to do. And with a river that's coming down from the mountain, it has an innate purpose, which is to reach the sea. It doesn't let go of that. It keeps with that purpose and allows itself to keep moving, finding its way around the obstacles. So keeping our line of sight on our goals or purpose enables us to adapt as needed, but we have to also accept a new attitude to the obstacles that may be presented. Now, when we then come to this subject of human psychology, there's much covered in this area on resilience, and again, I'm not intending to cover all of the ground that we have covered on other webinars and certainly can talk about, but I'll just flash up a few slides just so that we all know what we're talking about in this area. Firstly, to think about psychology, human psychology, we kind of get ourselves caught up in a little bit of success and failure mentality. And the organisational world and the organisational cultures really emphasise this a lot. As leaders, we tend to want to encourage success. We're not quite so good at helping people to feel confident and comfortable in failure. We come back again to learning. And consequently, we can set up a vicious circle whereby success is the only thing that is valued and that matters. The challenge with that is, of course, that it starts to define a certain world. What we really need to get to is this sense of who we are, our own identity, and how we show up in any situation and all situations, accepting both success and failure as part of that. In the generally kind of well talked about world of resilience, we will hear things certainly in the space of finding that sweet spot between the amount of stress or pressure that is coming in and the point at which that will affect our performance adversely. So if there is too much what is here called arousal in Selye's model, then we tip over that sweet spot at the top of this arc between dynamic and distracted, and we end up going down the other side of the curve, ultimately often into quite severe stress and unhealthy practices and ill health. Another model that many of you may have come across in the world of resilience is the work by Derek Mowbray, who helps us to think about resilience through this 8-pointed framework, and particularly focusing on how do I manage my own self and my awareness of myself. How do I interact with the organisation, and how do I make sure that I understand those situations that will help me to stay strong and clear, and also how do I build the right relationships. So this is a very useful model, again, for building resilience. Another area that we typically get into with the sort of psychology of resilience is how we react to change, and the neuroscience tells us that we do react to change in a similar way to as if we've been hit physically. It has that same reactions inside of our brain. And so we can and do go on and explore the various ways in which we need to recognize that and then adjust to it. So there are some very established practices around resilience from a psychology point of view, but I want to pick up on a couple of very particular areas that I think will serve us well in this time. And that's these 4. So control, our attitude to polarities, how we approach our mindset, and presence. Let's firstly just take a moment then on control. Control, I would argue, is an illusion. That's not to say we don't all strive for it, and we don't all like to tell ourselves that we feel more in control. And of course, that, coming back to that notion of flow, of course we do. We do feel more in control when we are in a place of flow. But actually, it's not control, it's a movement, it's a flexibility, it's that adaptability. And this Khalil Gibran quote is really powerful, I think, for helping us to think about the way that we approach this mindset of control and the anxiety that can come with that, because it's not really the future, which can look very uncertain, and particularly now is especially uncertain. It's not that we're necessarily scared of that, but it's our desire to control it that provokes our anxiety. And the more we feel we want to be in control, the higher our anxiety level will be. So again, in this time of emergence, being prepared to flex with what emerges, being willing to look at it, take a moment, work out how to respond within that space, then we will start to see our anxiety levels fall, and our co-creation, co-cooperation with that moment, with whatever is coming up in that moment, will increase, and we will find that we will feel more in flow, coming back to the natural world. So firstly, I think it's really important to think about our attitude to control. What do we think we're controlling? What do we want to control? And where could we move more into a co-creative space with that next moment in time, with that next eventuality that comes up? I mentioned polarities in this bit of human psychology, and we're going to do another webinar on this, so that's coming next, is our next webinar. But for now, I just wanted to introduce it here because I think it's a really important area of consideration for us in our resilience. And what do we mean by polarities? Well, essentially, polarity thinking is where we get ourselves caught in this or that. It's either this or it's that. It's black or it's white. So we tend to get ourselves a little bit caught up in one-dimensional thinking. Typically that will be because things have worked well for us. We've got a lot of experience and knowledge in a particular area, tried and tested practices, or because it just is the way that our belief system works, or it's part of our training and our knowledge. But it's also the way that we learn if we can start to recognize the opposite to the thing that we hold true. And the more we allow ourselves to explore the opposite, become familiar with the opposite, lean into the opposite, the more we will find ourselves moving to an and place rather than an either or place. So just looking at I put a few examples of what a polarity might be up on the screen. I'm going to pick one of them out, which I think is particularly pertinent right now, which is this just in time versus having some slack in the system. And again, coming back to organisational resilience, we know over the last decades there's been a heavy emphasis on lean and just in time, and really getting quite smart in the way that we run our organisations. And that's been to help us reduce cost and to make sure that we're not holding unnecessary fat within our operational systems. And that's served very well in many respects, and is, has got many qualities. We've been weeding out fat, or what here we've described as slack or waste or anything that is not helpful. So a lot of streamlining. The challenge with that, when we come into a time that is uncertain and has many surprises for us and many unknowns, is that there's nowhere to hide. The system comes under so much pressure that we've got nothing left in the tank. There is no resilience in the system, and we've not allowed ourselves the freedom to step back and have a little bit of space and maybe a little bit of buffer, which might be another way of looking at slack. So the value of slack is that it gives us something to lean on and to take a little bit of a breath with. So maybe I don't know, we've had obviously stockpiling going on in all sorts of ways over this time, and this is part of that sense of wanting to rush to the other side of the polarity. Let me have plenty in my store cupboard, that way I'll be more resilient. Of course, that has its downsides. The and situation is having just enough slack so that we can move a little bit more easily. We're not stressing in the moment. We've given ourselves a bit of breathing space. So polarities is something that is worth thinking about and looking at our own attitude to what we get attached to. As I say, more on that in our next webinar. The third area that I said I'd talk about, I'll come back to, is this one of mindset. And in typical terms, and certainly we use a lot, the Carol Dweck model of growth and fixed mindset, where we are thinking about the degree to which we are stuck in a kind of past experience, past learning model, and the degree to which in the growth mindset we're more open to new information, to an idea that learning is a continuous process. So that's the fixed and growth mindset. What I'm inviting us to think about here in this context, where we're thinking more about emergence, the challenge with a sort of more fixed mindset in these days is that it can lead to a lot of fears. It can lead to us feeling like we're more in the I can't space than the I can space. And the joy, if we can see it in the more emergent times that we're in, is the number of possibilities that open up. And we have seen this in the way that organizations have responded to home working or solving problems. Lots of stories of people who have been able to fix or move on things that have taken months and months and months to move even a millimetre, suddenly in a couple of days have been resolved very quickly. This is partly a mindset thing. This is partly a shift in a recognition that it is possible to do things differently, which draws on things like optimism, possibility, working in a more childlike way, sort of more curious, more playful, more openness, more curiosity. The more we can hold that, the more we're going to get into a little bit more of this dream space, not in some sort of away with the fairy sense, but in a sense that means that we are more likely to cooperate with what's in front of us. And the final area in the psychology area that I wanted to bring forward is this idea of presence. We've been running mindfulness, and some of you have been joining us in these mindfulness sessions. And this is a really key area, I think, again, for organisational and individual personal resilience. How do we create space, coming back to that word slack, some little bit of space and time in our system and in our lives for reflection, for taking a moment, for taking some time out, In the mindfulness, we talk about and practice breathing, such a basic part of our lives, such a fundamental part of our lives. And yet, just being able to literally and metaphorically take a breath and bring ourselves much more present within our bodies, within our emotions, within our mind, and to be aware of what's going on, and to use the breathing to allow us to step into a slightly different space, allows us then to access new resources. So whether it's mindfulness, whether it's reflection, as in going for a walk and switching the mind to a completely different context and set of images and connecting with nature, whether it's about literally carving out 5 minutes in the diary, but allowing ourselves that space of presence. And from an organizational point of view, building a practice of reflection, building a practice of taking a bit of time, building a practice of pacing ourselves, and recognizing that things don't all have to go at breakneck speed. I've mentioned our third area a number of times as I've gone through so far, and this is the area of learning. If we go right back to the beginning and the Roffey model that I offered up, it's one of their biggest areas, as you will have seen, in organisational resilience. And learning is, again, a natural part of our lives. We do it instinctively. So we have learning that comes to us in a very everyday sense, and then we have intentional learning where we perhaps go on a course, or we read a book, or we somehow add to our knowledge. Both sets of learning have a value, and again, both sets of learning need to be applied, and that's done through the lens of reflection. But another factor in our learning that I wanted to pick out is about meaning and how we make meaning, which is partly a psychological process, but also it's a mindset. So how meaning making is a phrase that is used in some development areas, and essentially this is about the process by which we make sense of particular situations and so on. And our meaning making genes will have been going on overdrive in these past weeks and months as we try to absorb and make sense of all sorts of different experiences and data that has been coming our way as we've attempted to understand, have some sort of relationship with the crisis, with the virus, with however that's touching our lives in any number of different ways, professionally and personally. So our meaning making, our sense making, will have been really on high alert in this time for most people. The challenge with meaning making is that, again, we come back to the degree to which we are doing that from a place of the past, and the degree to which we are prepared to step back into a new perspective, or step into a new perspective, and create a new frame, and to find ways in which we can approach the learning from a new perspective. And so what is really critical in our learning process is our ability to shift perspective. To shift perspective away from an emphasis on efficiency. Again, particularly in an organizational space, we're tending to look at learning through the lens of performance and efficiency, and getting into being effective in that sense. With emergence, our performance and efficiency is much more in the moment. It relies much more on our agility and our ability to shift our lens through 360 degrees sometimes in order to make new meaning, make new sense. And as we do that, we elevate, we lift our resources to a higher level. And so our learning becomes multidimensional as we look to a much broader space and draw on a much broader set of resources, all of which are included in those things I've already spoken about. So shifting our perspective is one of the key factors that will help us in adopting new learning and being in a more ready state of learning, a more perpetual state of learning, which is really being in the moment of learning, as opposed to that being more of a tick box. Yeah, got that piece of knowledge, can store that away. It's a much more dynamic and organic space. And another thing that I think is quite a useful tool in this space of learning, and this is something that Seth Godin, which some of you may be aware of him. He's a marketeer, but he really gets into the space of creative thinking, and he introduced this idea of the Fremen principle. The Fremens are a fictional group of natives of the desert planet Arrakis, living with very little water. So that's where the name comes from. But essentially what this principle is about is, if we want to learn something new, then let's look to someone or a group of someones who are used to doing what it is we're trying to do, but maybe in a completely different context. So in this example, if we take the Fremen themselves, if we want to know how to work with new or limited resources, and maybe we're facing that as we move forward in this process that we're in at the moment, organisationally and personally, we may have less resources. Let's find a population that's used to not having so many alternatives. We've enjoyed a plethora of alternatives in many ways in our world. Perhaps now those are narrowing. So what if we were to think about, well, what would the Fremen do in that sort of example, where they have to live with very little water? The point here is that it's again stepping into creativity. It's stepping into a different level of inquiry and openness. So when we think about learning in this space of emergence, we come to a model that we use a lot, and that is based on the Canafin model. And really what we're doing here is looking at this complex space, the complex space which is not very easy to deal with at times. It is non-linear, and again, organisationally, we like that linearity. Maybe some of us, particularly in our lives, do as well. We're not so comfortable with this in-the-moment emergence, but this is the space that we find ourselves in more and more these days. And the attitude that we have to hold here is that there are no right answers. Again, we like right answers. We like there to be a black and white. Think about that polarities element. It does require us to probe and to sense and to be in relationship, both with the moment and with other people and with the situation and with the resources we have available to us, or that we need to go out and find. It requires us to be in a space where we are willing to experiment, test, play. And again, we don't tend to favour that risk-taking in organisations. So there's something about moving into a much more flexible and fluid space, again, drawing on nature with the flow. And this will help us to build a new level of resilience. And I'm not for 1 minute saying any of this is easy. I'm simply reminding us that this is a place that if we truly want to step into this next space in human evolution, we will need, as organizations and as individuals, to detach ourselves slightly from that need for certainty, that need for control, and that need for things to be quite so fixed in our lives. Which brings us, in summary, to this idea of dance. And hopefully what I've offered through some of the ideas I've put forward here today is this metaphor of dance, this idea of being in perpetual movement and moving into a place of greater fluidity and flexibility. And if I come back to one of the slides I put up very early on from Cranfield and BSI, this isn't about saying we never want to be in a more process or routine or consistent space. Of course, there will be times when that is exactly what is needed and how we should be functioning. But if we can, from an attitudinal point of view, allow ourselves to be more in this free-moving, adaptive, mindful, flexible space, we will find that we can cross over and anchor things when they need and are ready to be anchored, but at the same time, let them go when we need to, and move quickly and with greater openness into a new way of thinking and being. This demands a lot of us. It demands us to really visualize ourselves, maybe not quite as beautiful as this, although perhaps our inner dancer looks exactly like this gorgeous ballet dancer who is in perpetual movement and yet perpetual stillness. So everything in her body is moving, and yet at the same time she has that illusion of being, and fact of being, in the moment of silence, of stillness, of poise, and of flow. So hopefully this has stimulated something slightly different for you in terms of your approach to resilience. We do need new resources in this period. We do need to give ourselves permission, personally and as teams and as whole organizations, to draw a little bit more on the lessons of nature and to give ourselves a little bit more whole thinking when it comes to the way we are approaching the challenges ahead of us. And this, I believe, will help us to reduce our anxiety, to be more ready, to be more up for some of the opportunities, and some of them will be fantastic opportunities that lie ahead. For now, I'd like to say thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening, and apologies that there really isn't more time for sharing. And our future webinars will be longer in length. We're going for an hour instead, just to hopefully build in a little bit more time for some sharing. We do have a leadership series coming up that will run through May, June, and the early part of July. There will be 4 webinars, and we'll be exploring some of these capabilities that we've touched on here today, but not specifically just about resilience, that hopefully will also help to seed some new ideas and some new thinking about this really quite amazing time, notwithstanding obviously the tragedies of the time too, but really quite amazing time that I think sits ahead of us. So look out for those. We'll be mailing those out from next week, and we'd be delighted to see you with us again, and hopefully literally see you, because as I say, we'll be opening it up a little bit more for discussion and conversation. But for now, thank you. Have a great day, and see you very soon. Bye for now.